Emily's eyes were burning with tiredness, yet sleep seemed impossible to attain. The flickering light of the bedside lamp failed to illuminate even the darkest corners of the room. Her gaze appeared fixed upon the ceiling, her thoughts adrift in space. The howling of the wind outside engulfed the silence. However, within that silence, she sensed a shift. As she gently closed her eyes, she heard a faint clicking coming from a corner of the room. Hastily, she opened her eyes again, but she couldn't see what it was. Only vague silhouettes loomed in the darkness of the room, the light from the lamp failing to sharpen them. Silence prevailed for a while as Emily breathed slowly, her heart beating rapidly. At that moment, she startled at the faint clicking once more. Her eyes darted in that direction, but still, she couldn't see anything. There was only silence and darkness. She tried to relax, thinking it might be just something conjured up in her mind. Yet, within that silence, she felt a change. A tension enveloped her soul, causing her hairs to stand on end. Unable to bear it any longer, she slowly rose from the bed and reached out to turn on the lamp beside her with trembling hands. Light flooded the room instantly, yet her eyes were still fixated on that dark corner. As the room illuminated, she saw a shadow swiftly sliding across the curtain at the other end of the room. Her heart tightened in her chest, feeling as if a threatening presence was creeping into the room. Forcing herself to step towards the curtain, she swiftly pulled it open with her trembling hand. But behind it, there was only an empty room and silence. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, but there was no movement. However, the tension within her did not subside. If anything, it intensified. She heard the door creak open slightly. She turned around, her eyes wide with fear. In the dark corridor, a silhouette appeared hazily. Without understanding what it was, she fled from the room and pounded on the front door of the house, hoping one of her neighbors would come to her aid. But as she pushed against the door, she realized it was locked. She pounded on it repeatedly, her screams echoing, but there was no response. That night, Emily found herself locked in her room, alone in the darkness and silence, with only her own fear for company. Emily's heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. The silence of the room was filled with a dreadful tension. Locked behind the door, she waited helplessly, unable to understand what was happening to her. Suddenly, she heard a faint rustle from a corner of the room. Her eyes widened with fear, her breath hitched. For a moment, she stood frozen, then slowly approached the wardrobe. She opened it slowly, revealing only the items inside. However, a shadow emerged from behind the wardrobe. Her heart pounded rapidly, her eyes widened. A hand extended from the shadows, causing her to hold her breath. That hand slowly reached out towards her. Emily tremblingly opened the wardrobe further. A hand extended from the shadows, reaching out to her. Her heart pounded rapidly as she tried to pull back, but she felt something pulling her towards the wardrobe. Suddenly, a voice whispered from within the wardrobe. "Don't leave me here, help me." The voice was raspy, but distinctly audible. Emily froze, her eyes widening. She recognized the voice, but couldn't remember where from. Instinctively, she reached into the wardrobe, trying to grasp the shadow with her hand. However, the shadow vanished suddenly, and the wardrobe closed quietly. Emily recoiled, breathless. At that moment, she felt something moving in the room. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, but she couldn't see anything. However, she knew she wasn't alone in that dark room. A silence filled with fear prevailed as Emily stood helplessly in the center of her room, confronting the terrifying tension within her. Emily could feel something moving in the room, but she couldn't see it with her eyes. A fear-filled silence enveloped everything. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she didn't know what to do, then she gathered her courage and quietly decided to leave the room. She moved slowly towards the door, every step careful. When she reached the door, she quietly opened it and peered into the corridor. However, the corridor was empty. Emily cautiously took steps forward as she made her way to the other rooms of the house. Finally, she reached the front door and stepped outside. The cool night air hit her face. She took a deep breath and scanned her surroundings, but she couldn't see anyone. At that moment, some of the tension inside her eased, but she still felt a sense of unease. When she returned home and got back into bed, the terrifying experience she had just lived through continued to replay in her mind. Perhaps it was just a nightmare, she thought, but there was still a lingering doubt within her. As days passed, Emily couldn't forget the incident. Despite being away from her house, the fear within her didn't diminish. However, with time, she accepted the event as a nightmare and continued with her life. Yet, on some nights, she still remembered the tension she felt in that dark room. Perhaps there really was something moving in the room, or perhaps it was just a product of her own fears. She would never know for sure. In the end, Emily learned from her experience. Facing the darkness isn't easy, but having the courage to confront one's inner fears makes one stronger. And now, she was ready to face the darkness, because she had become the master of her fears.